Our first guest is Craig Mokhiber, who resigned from the UN Human Rights Office in October to protest the world body's inaction in the face of the unfolding genocide in Gaza. Craig, it's so good to have you back on with us today. Thanks for being here.
Very nice to be with you. Thanks, Nora.
So let's begin by having you react to the US's veto at the UN Security Council and these Western leaders saying that a ceasefire isn't in the best interests of Palestinians.
I mean, it's outrageous. What can one say after 3 successive vetoes by the United States of ceasefires in the Security Council, after which thousands more have died each time, and many more will die after their veto of this ceasefire. As I've said before, I'll say it again, this is another piece of evidence of U.S. complicity in genocide in Gaza. And this is just one of many, many acts on the part of the U.S. government that have to be compiled by lawyers that ultimately will have to make this case. It's absolutely stunning to listen to the hypocrisy of the U.S. ambassador explaining their position in the Security Council as she stands in the way of a ceasefire to stop the horror in Gaza. Obviously, not unexpected. The U.S. is a participant in genocide in Gaza. There's no other way to put together their continuous military, economic, intelligence, dissemination of propaganda, support, all of the things that they're doing, including the use of the veto, than to say that they are a willing and active participant in genocide in Gaza.
And Craig, not only that, but you have likely seen the reports that as Israel threatens to and prepares to invade Rafah, where 1.5 million people are seeking shelter, the Biden administration announced that it's getting ready to send more bombs to Israel. Is that consistent with efforts to achieve a ceasefire or protect civilians?
There's further evidence of their hypocrisy, obviously. I think that the Biden administration has been active, I think, as we discussed before, in these periodic fig leaf harvesting exercises, as I've called it, where they try to divert attention away from their active participation in the genocide by talking about the trickle of aid trucks that they help to facilitate, about their encouragement, allegedly, that Israel abide by international law, which is an absurd suggestion at this point. 4 months in, about their insistence that they're doing everything to negotiate a resolution of the conflict. These are fig leaves, and what they're doing actively, and this is a further evidence of that, is funding, supporting, defending, shielding the genocide effort in Gaza. So it's all very consistent.
And there are reports, Craig, that have been circulating, particularly in Arab media, of preparations on the Egyptian side of the border to receive possibly tens of thousands of Palestinians. Of course, Egypt claims that it would be opposed to any mass transfer of Palestinians from Gaza. And indeed, the United States claims that it's opposed to that. What's your assessment? We have Israeli politicians who continue to say that they want to get rid of the Palestinians in Gaza. Do you think that risk has diminished or increased in recent weeks and months?
I think it's increased as they felt that they are moving closer and closer to their goal. They see this congregation of humanity in the southernmost part of Gaza, in and around Rafah, and they feel very, very close to their objective of the total ethnic purge of Gaza. So one can only imagine the pressure that's being brought to bear on the Egyptian regime to collaborate in the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. And I think that, you can look at it generously and say that those satellite images of the construction happening on the Egyptian side of the border are just emergency preparations for any eventuality. But it's hard to imagine that kind of investment and that rapid construction that's happening there isn't happening with an expectation that they will be involved in the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. So it's a terrifying moment. I think there are some diplomatic pressures being brought to bear on the Israelis by Western powers that have been embarrassed and politically compromised by Israel's absolute lack of any limitations whatsoever in its genocidal assault. I think that explains some of the delay in a full-scale onslaught through Gaza, in spite of the absolutely horrific attacks that are already taking place. I mean, there's no diminishing those, but whether that will hold, I doubt it. I don't think that the regime in Israel has any intention of pulling back yet, and that they really want to finish the job. And finishing the job means either killing everybody or killing enough people and making the conditions as unbearable as possible, so that those survivors who do remain will force their way across the border in Rafah, and then be no longer, Israel's problem, because they will be forced to live out their lives in tents in the Sinai or travel into the diaspora. But I think that is still the intention of Israel, and I think that all signs are that they're going to go through with it.
That's extremely sobering and depressing, and a reminder that we cannot in any way let up on whatever pressure we as citizens of our countries can bring to bear. And of course, the engineered starvation is a key factor in that. We see increasing reports of real starvation in Gaza, deaths and malnutrition, particularly in young children. Hundreds of babies are born every day in Gaza. Their mothers are unable to produce milk for them because they themselves are malnourished. And of course, they can't find clean water or formula for them. So it's just utterly horrifying. But then, of course, how many countries is it now? 16 or 18 countries cut funding or froze funding to UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, and the last lifeline for millions of people relying on its basic humanitarian support at a time when the situation is getting worse and worse. And they did so based on completely unproven allegations from Israel that 12 of the 13,000 UNRWA staff in Gaza took part in the resistance operation on October 7th. How do you square the protestations of these Western countries that they want to see as much humanitarian aid getting into Gaza with that decision to freeze funding to UNRWA based on these bogus Israeli accusations, which even the head of UNRWA says they've received no proof for at this point?
Absolutely. You can't square it. And I think, again, just that the word complicity keeps coming up again and again. Cutting off the most essential aid organization in Gaza in the midst of a genocide is an act of complicity, particularly when it's done on the basis of, first, evidence that was said to have been had come from interrogations by Shin Bet torturers in the first instance. And when that wasn't flying, the usual line about intercepted conversations, which often turn out to be false on the part of the Israelis, and the allegation itself being a dozen, although a shifting number. It's a dozen, it's 10, some are dead, some are alive, maybe it's 6, maybe it's 4, later maybe it's over 100. The shifting number is being presented by the Israelis in what has been decades and decades of politicized attacks on UNRWA by Israel, because UNRWA stands in the way of their ethno-nationalist plan for Gaza and the West Bank as well. So the fact that Western states would accept, without any evidence, claims that a few people may have participated in, we don't even know if they participated in unlawful activities, only that the allegations are that they left Gaza when the fence was torn down. But a few people, let's say that 12 people committed crimes on October 7th. Is that a justification for defunding an organization of 30,000 staff, a UN agency with multiple layers of oversight that is absolutely essential, particularly in a moment of genocide? And I've said, and I'll say it again, give me a list of US government employees who have committed crimes, and on that basis, let's see, there are a heck of a lot more than a dozen of those. On that basis, let's defund the US government. It is an absolutely absurd claim. And the fact, and this is for people who care at all about the capture of their own governments, the fact that a foreign government, which has been plausibly accused of committing genocide, essentially gave an order to a number of Western governments to cut off aid for UNRWA, and then they did so, should make people worry very much about the functioning of their own governments in the West, in the US, and the United Kingdom, and Canada, and elsewhere.
You just mentioned that Israel has been plausibly accused of genocide. I think you're referring to the International Court of Justice decision delivered on January 26th, in which indeed the court found that South Africa plausibly accused Israel of genocide, and they ordered provisional, or is it preventive measures? Basically, they ordered Israel to halt all potentially genocidal acts. Israel has ignored that. South Africa went back to the court on February 12th with a letter highlighting their concerns about Israel's continuing and indeed escalating violence. And the court issued a decision, this is the International Court of Justice, on February 16th, stating the court notes that the most recent developments in the Gaza Strip and in Rafah in particular would exponentially increase what is already a humanitarian nightmare with untold regional consequences. And the court added, this perilous situation demands immediate and effective implementation of the provisional measures indicated by the court on January 26th. What do you make of that statement by the court? Is it unusual? What does it tell us about how this case is proceeding? And I'm going to ask you about the hearings that are currently going on in the ICJ that are a separate case. We'll get to that. But what do you make of the subsequent developments in the South Africa genocide case?
Well, I think what the court was saying here, and you've addressed some of the language that they've used on exponential increase in what's happening on the ground. They've noted that they've demanded this immediate and effective implementation of the provisional measures that they already ordered. And remember, they ordered Israel to stop all of the genocidal acts about which we are all concerned, that are causing these harms. So that immediate and effective implementation of the provisional measures order is not nothing here. They didn't order any additional provisional measures, and I think it's because the view is that what the court has done is already comprehensive. I think we spoke before about the fact that the people who are disappointed about the lack of the use of the word ceasefire weren't reading the case as carefully as they should, because there is no way to implement what the court has ordered without a ceasefire. They've ordered them to stop killing and harming Palestinians and destroying civilian infrastructure, and to allow the free flow of aid, and to stop all of the incitement and so on. You can't do any of those things without stopping the attacks. And that still stands. And what the court said in this second statement was that you needed to immediately and effectively implement those. They also said, they reminded that Israel is bound to fully comply with its obligations under the Genocide Convention. So again, they're raising the specter of genocide, and with the order about it, including by ensuring the safety and security of all of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. So that decision was not nothing. It didn't order anything new, but I think it didn't order anything new because it had already issued a comprehensive order on what needed to be done on the ground. And in this decision, or this statement, what they said was, now you need to do that immediately, because the risk is now even higher with what is happening in the siege around Rafah in particular. So I think it was, for me, pretty much to be expected, given all of the detail that was contained in the original order on the provisional measures. And now, of course, we know that Israel, not only have they not implemented any of the provisional measures, so they are in breach of the order, but you've actually seen an upsurge in violative activities by Israel since the order was issued, and they are now due for their report to the court, because Israel is under the supervision of the World Court, because they found it plausible that genocide is being committed, and they're duty bound to report back. And then I think you'll see further action, first by South Africa, who brought the case and who will comment on Israel's report, but then by the court itself and by everyone who is obliged to try to enforce the order of the court.
I just want to say, no, I know Nora wants to move us to the next ICJ case, but I just want to say that we haven't had you on since the January 26th ICJ decision, but in other broadcasts, you made the very important point that this was a very strong decision, because at the time when it came out, there was all this debate, oh, they didn't use the word ceasefire. My view of that was that in an armed conflict, you call for a ceasefire. In a genocide, you call for an end to all genocidal acts, which goes far beyond a ceasefire, because a ceasefire means shooting of guns and dropping bombs, whereas ending all genocidal acts means all of that, but it also means ending the starvation, ending the siege, ending the countless other measures that Israel has imposed. So I just want to put that on the record here on the Electronic Intifada live stream, that the fact that the ICJ didn't use the term ceasefire is a distraction. This was a very strong decision. Do you agree with that?
Framing is important, because this is not a war, it's a genocide. And we don't want to be distracted and start to accidentally adopt the language of those who are justifying what's happening in Gaza as some kind of a war. It's not, it's a genocide. And I don't think it would be an issue at all, except the word ceasefire appeared effectively in the petition that the South Africans put forward. But the court is correct. This is not, the framing of this is not a war between two warring parties. It is a genocide against a civilian population. And so their command that all of those actions that amount to genocide, including attacking the people, is a constructive ceasefire in the sense that they have to stop the attacks. That's what that means. But it's much more than that as well, because it goes beyond simply stopping the attacks, and it deals with all of the issues that relate to incitement and so on that were mentioned by the court. So absolutely, that's the correct framing.
Craig, I do want to ask about the current ICJ hearings that are happening this week in The Hague, but I want to just get your comment on enforcement of the ICJ provisional orders, because that's something that a lot of people are, rightly frustrated about, where they issue these provisional measures. Israel flippantly and blatantly says they're not going to, be dictated by The Hague. They're thumbing their nose at South Africa. They're, they're saying explicitly that they won't change a thing. And as you mentioned, the attacks have escalated over the last month. What kind of enforcement could be expected, could happen? Is it even possible? Or does Israel get to submit its report? I guess next week they're due to submit their report, saying, yeah, we didn't do any of the things. The ICJ says, well, we tried. I mean, what is, I know that the courts are not going to be the thing that stops the genocide by themselves. But what does enforcement mean at this stage?
Well, of course, decisions of the court are supposed to be, they are binding, first of all. So they are legally binding. They're not optional in a contentious case such as this. Where they are not implemented, it falls on the Security Council in the first instance to enforce them, because the Security Council has actual enforcement power. Of course, the US will veto any effort in the Security Council to enforce the decision of the court. And when that happens, you can expect that the decision will then go to the General Assembly under the Uniting for Peace resolution in an emergency special session. And there, one of two things can happen. Either you'll get a lukewarm resolution that almost everyone signs on to, that says Israel should stop what it's doing and, deploring everything that's happening. But there's another possibility. You could have a resolution in the General Assembly that actually contains teeth. It could, for example, call for the removal of Israel from certain international organizations. It could call for diplomatic and consular measures, non-recognition of passports. It could call for economic and political measures against Israel. It could call for legal measures, to bring perpetrators to justice in criminal trials in third-party courts, for example. It could establish a tribunal on its own, a legal tribunal, an international criminal tribunal, to hold Israeli perpetrators and other perpetrators in principle to account. There are a whole range of things that could be contained in a General Assembly resolution that could give force to that and could help to bring the kind of pressure to bear, both on Israel and on its, allow me to say it, its co-génocidaires in Washington and London and elsewhere, so that this situation isn't allowed to continue. Even if the General Assembly doesn't adopt that kind of a resolution, and you can be sure the US will deploy all of its carrots, all of its sticks, all of its diplomatic missions all around the world to bring pressure to bear on individual state delegations in the General Assembly, especially poor countries of the South, to prevent them from supporting anything meaningful in the General Assembly resolution. The US doesn't have a veto in the GA, but it is quite ruthless in what it does and what it says to delegations that want to vote in a principled way on these kinds of things. So it's not clear where that would go. I have a fair amount of confidence that you could, in spite of the US's best efforts, get a strong resolution in the General Assembly that included some of these concrete measures. I think the most important of which in a GA resolution would be something like a tribunal. By the way, they could also set up mechanisms, as they did in apartheid South Africa, anti-apartheid mechanisms and so on, that would dedicate and rally the resources of the UN to the anti-apartheid struggle, the anti-genocide struggle, and so on. So there's a lot that the GA could do. But even if they don't, individual states and groups of states are obliged, when there is genocide or even a threat or risk of genocide, to take action individually and collectively within their power to bring that pressure to bear. And we'll talk more about that, I think, when we talk about the current discussion in the ICJ. And then finally, and you hinted at this, Nora, the real power is in civil society. I mean, if you see a change in tone, although not in action on the part of a number of Western governments now, it's because of the pressure from civil society, from movements, protests, labor unions, all those sorts of things that have been, frankly, bringing shame on their own governments for their participation in the genocide that's happening here. And there you could see an upsurge in the anti-apartheid movement, in boycotts and divestment and sanctions, all of the things that could have real teeth just coming from civil society itself. So we have a lot of options for enforcement. Where the official options fail, there are plans B, C, and D. And then the lower you get down the ladder, the more I'm seeing an upsurge in action that gives me reason for hope that this time there won't be absolute impunity as there has been in the past.
Well, on that particular point, before we go back to the ICJ, I just want to highlight that since we last had you on, I don't know if we can show this, Tamara. I dropped the link in the chat. We've had 2 Japanese companies end deals with 𝐓𝐡𝐞, Israel's largest arms maker, and one of them specifically cited the ICJ decision. And also we had Wallonia, which is one of the 3 federal regions of Belgium and is itself a major arms exporter, cancel arms export licenses to Israel, again, citing the ICJ decision. So that is perhaps a hopeful sign that the decision is filtering down. If governments are not, the top level world powers are not necessarily acting, we are seeing it filter down in other ways. And then we have these current hearings going on now, which I think, Nora, you wanted to ask about.
Yeah, and you mentioned this, Craig, that it's not just the genocide that's happening right now currently in Gaza, but it is 75 years of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, of occupation, of violations of human rights, of war crimes, of the entire gamut that Israel's state project has always been, and the occupation has been also brought to the ICJ this week by a coalition of something like 52 different countries, UN member states, brought by Algeria. Can you talk about? Sorry, that was the Security Council, but at the ICJ, can you talk about the hearings that are happening this week and the significance of those testimonies?
Actually, I think 87 countries voted for the resolution in the General Assembly to bring this to the World Court, with a lot of abstentions, but a very strong majority, which I think is another good reason for hope. So yeah, Israel is already on trial for genocide. And I think we can't say that enough because of all the distortion in the media. Israel is on trial for genocide. They're already in breach both of the previous World Court decision in 2004 on the illegality of the apartheid wall, and, as I've said, they're in breach of the provisional measures that were ordered by the court in the genocide case just last month. Well, now it's on trial again at the World Court, but this time, and very importantly, the occupation itself is on trial. And support for that occupation by other states is on trial. So support from third states like the US and UK and others is also on trial in the way that this case has been framed. And, you know, if you read the submissions and you listen to the oral interventions, by extension, it's also no exaggeration to say that the whole ideological project of Israel is also on trial to some degree. And very importantly, and this is, I think, where I find the most hope, the Oslo paradigm, or the Oslo ruse, as I call it, is also on trial. Because that was the dominant framework for dealing with the question of Palestine for more than 30 years, that sidestepped and subverted international law in favor of negotiations between occupier and occupied, which of course just means deference to the powerful one, which is the occupier. In fact, the very desperate arguments of the few states that are opposed to the case are mostly rooted in that point. They know that Israel cannot prevail under international law, so they insist that the law be set aside in favor of the politics of Oslo, where Israel can prevail. In other words, you know, deference to the status quo, deference to the power of Israel and its Western allies, like the US. That's the way they want to see it continue. You know these arguments from the US, from the UK, frankly, from Judge Sebutinde, in the only one who voted against the provisional measures in the World Court. They're saying, you know, that the court should stay out of it and leave it to these powerful states and to the politics of Oslo. That's not going to happen. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and Craig, I mean, just to back up for a second, just for our viewers. So this particular case, we've spoken about the South Africa genocide case. This is a separate case, and it's brought in a different manner. The UN General Assembly has the right to ask the court for an advisory opinion on certain matters. And that's what happened in 2004 with the International Court of Justice decision you just mentioned on Israel's apartheid wall. That was an advisory opinion that said the wall is illegal. This is another case where the General Assembly asked the International Court of Justice to provide an advisory opinion on the legal consequences of Israel's prolonged occupation. And as I understand it, I'm not a lawyer, but again, I'm trying to explain it for myself and for our viewers. Under international law, military occupation itself is not a crime. War of aggression may be, and the things you do when you're a military occupier may be, but the occupation itself is not a crime. But it is governed by international law, by the Fourth Geneva Convention and other instruments. But because of the special nature of this occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip that has now gone on for 57 years, I believe the argument here is that this occupation is inherently illegal and gives rise to a whole number of crimes, and that the legal consequences should be that third states have an obligation to act. In other words, they have to take measures that deny Israel any of the resources, or whether it's economic, military, political, and so on, that allow this occupation to continue. You've pointed out that various states, the usual suspects, the US, the Europeans, are saying, well, even if what Israel is doing is illegal or undesirable or unhelpful or whatever euphemisms they may use, the right way to deal with it is not through enforcement of the law and sanctioning Israel, but through these endless negotiations. I'm sorry to say that another country we should add to that list is Russia, because the intervention of the Russian representative at the court this morning was exactly that. The Russian Federation recognized that Israel is committing a whole slew of crimes, but explicitly asked the court not to impose any measures or obligations, but simply to urge a return to the so-called peace process. Is that a fair summary of what's at stake here?
It's a very good framing. This is an advisory opinion, which is an authoritative legal advice by the World Court, which states can't ignore. States do ignore it, but they can't ignore it and be claiming a law-based approach. This is the definition of the law. It's not binding on individuals, but it sets out what the law requires. And we'll probably have a final decision in the summer. But that's exactly right. Now, there are a number of states, like the Russian Federation that you mentioned, that are taking basically a position that, yeah, the occupation is illegal. A number of acts associated with the occupation are unlawful as well, but they still try to preserve. They're trying to preserve the space for this Oslo track, as we've been calling it. And you can imagine that Russia, which had an influential role in the quartet and that whole formulation, is trying to retain that option as well. And a number of states have taken that kind of a position, states like Nauru in Canada and others. But there are only, this is the largest case in terms of the number of intervening states in the history of the World Court. More than 50 countries are intervening in this case. And of all of those countries, only 2 of them are defending the legality of the occupation. That's the United States, surprise, surprise, and Fiji, on the other hand. The others are affirming the court's right to hear this, are affirming the illegality of the occupation of Israel's actions, but some of them are trying to retain some space for that political process. The question before the court was put there by the General Assembly in December of 2022, in fact. And it's saying under the charter, under international law, under international humanitarian law, international human rights law, Security Council resolutions, and so on, they're asking the court to say, what are the legal consequences arising from and this is a quote, the ongoing violation by Israel. So it's already a given fact here that Israel is in violation of international law. But what are the legal consequences of those violations of the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination? Very important piece of this, from its prolonged occupation, settlement, and annexation of Palestinian territory. Its measures aimed at altering the demographic composition, character, and status of Jerusalem. And another big piece of this, related discriminatory legislation and measures. And we'll get into the question of apartheid on that. And then secondly, Ali, as you mentioned, the other question before the court is, how do these policies and practices affect the legal status of the occupation? And what are the consequences that arise from that, the legal consequences for other states, for all states under the United Nations? And here, they're looking at violations by Israel of a number of so-called peremptory norms of international law. These are the rules that can't be broken. There are no excuses for them. There's no derogation allowed. Rules that are jus cogens, non-derogable for any reason, and in legal language, erga omnes, which means they impose obligations on all states. There's no way out of this one. That includes The three most important ones in this case: the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force, which Israel has been doing repeatedly, obviously; the self-determination of the Palestinian people, which is a confirmed right of the Palestinian people, which is use cogens and erga omnes. In other words, there are no excuses. It's not something to be negotiated or delayed. That's a right that exists right now and has to be respected right now. And it imposes obligations on all states. And then thirdly, basically apartheid. And this piece is really interesting because once again, you had a very powerful presentation by South Africa, in which the South African presenter said that what the Palestinians have been subjected to is, quote, a more severe form of apartheid than they themselves were subjected to in South Africa. So there's a very clear focus on the illegality of the occupation itself, owing to its permanence, the acts that are used in keeping it in there, as well as an illegality of the many acts that Israel uses to implement and enforce the occupation, all sorts of abuses, right? Theft of land, settlements, gross violations of human rights, grave breaches of humanitarian law, war crimes, crimes against humanity, apartheid, genocide, all of that is there. And I think really exciting, if you listen to a lot of the testimony, the submissions, they're finally looking at the root causes as well. Many have already been raised in the court: dispossession, settler colonialism, Jewish supremacism, racism, racial discrimination, apartheid. These are a part of a number of the submissions that have gone into the court, both oral and written. And so far, I think the signs are very encouraging. You have a strong majority who voted in favor of this referral to the court. Western nations actually split on this. You had unanimous support from Islamic countries, Arab countries, even those that were involved in, this Abraham Accord nonsense. You had Russia and China voting in favor of the resolution. And then you only had Israel, the US, and 24 states, obviously the UK, Germany, states like that, voting against the resolution. But some Western states voted for it, like France. And then a bunch of them abstained, as often they're cowardly want to do. And then secondly, there have been hundreds of official documents submitted in evidence by the United Nations that document Israeli violations going all the way back to 1967 until today. Hundreds upon hundreds of these documents that have produced. People say, why does the UN spend all of its time documenting all of these things and nothing ever changes? This is why. Because this is now evidence. This is reliable evidence submitted in a court of law. And then thirdly, the written and oral submissions that have so far been received by these 50 countries that are presenting arguments are mostly supportive of Palestine's position, overwhelmingly so, on Israel's policies in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. And as I said, this is the largest number of parties to ever participate in a single ICJ case since the ICJ was established in 1945. Fourth, you have the clear requirements of international law themselves, which are entirely on the side of the Palestinians here, which again is why there's a push by the US and others to try to get this out of a court of law and back into the political realm where they can dominate the developments on the ground. For example, under international law, the Palestinians have a right to self-determination that is non-negotiable, unconditional, and immediate, right? It doesn't have to be negotiated. Israel, the US, no one has a right to veto it, as they do in the political process, but as a matter of law, they do not. It's use cogens, non-derogable. Erga omnes imposes obligations on all states. And those obligations on third states, including the US and others, the court is looking at these as well. And those include the principles of non-recognition. So you cannot recognize Israel's illegal activities in the occupied territories in any way. Non-assistance is another obligation. You can't assist in any way. You can't help them carry out these abuses in any way. Clearly, Western states are in breach of this. And there's a duty to cooperate to end the situation as a matter of international law. So, if this were implemented, it would be a clear legal statement on the illegality and the illegitimacy of what Western states are doing in providing support to Israel's illegal activities, but also it would be the end of legitimacy of any Abraham Accord kind of efforts to try to buy off the frontline states in this situation. And then you'll be familiar with this from the genocide case as well. Another reason for hope is that Israel's written submission is very weak. It's basically comprised of, legally irrelevant claims, some absurd claims. They provide like a short document that essentially claims the UN is biased. We've heard that before. The Palestinians are terrorists. The land belongs to them because the Bible promised it or something, blah, blah, blah. Insisting that everything should be left to negotiation between the parties. We know why they say that.
Which they refuse to do. Negotiations which they also refuse to take part in.
For over a decade, right?
Yeah.
And saying then we don't consent to the ICJ considering this case, so you better not do it, right? Yeah. And then finally, and this is really, I think, interesting to see in a law case, the remedies that are being raised by states that are making submissions are also a reason for hope. They're talking about immediately and unconditionally and completely ending the occupation, dismantling the settlements, allowing the right of return, paying reparations, releasing all of the Palestinian prisoners, ending the siege of Gaza, right? So, of course, Israel is not going to pay any attention to this. Of course, the Americans, the Brits, and others will be backing them up. But as a matter of law, you will have this clear legal statement by the highest court if they adopt these, what is being put forward for them. And this seems to me are the legal consequences of a decision of this kind, is that you have to say if these things are unlawful, they have to end immediately as a matter of law. So the importance and the power of this testimony, I think, shouldn't be underestimated. You've got one by one. Speakers are cataloging publicly and for the record this horrific 76-year catalog of abuses, crimes, atrocities, and their manifest illegality under international law. Also, and this is the human piece of this thing so far, their impact on people, on Palestinian children and women and men. There was a moment in the hearings when the Palestinian representative, Ambassador Riyad Mansour, ambassador to the UN, broke down in tears as he spoke of the ruthless dehumanization and persecution of Palestinian children by the Israeli regime that views them, in his words, as a demographic threat, not as children. And, at that moment, he wasn't an ambassador. He wasn't the PA. He was a Palestinian man who was born in the first year of the Nakba in 1947, who lived his entire life watching his people suffocated under the boot of settler colonialism and apartheid and persecution and, ethnic cleansing after ethnic cleansing. And you could just feel that he was making one last almost desperate appeal to the world for simple recognition that the Palestinian people are human beings with human rights. And that the testimony of the Palestinians who opened the case and of the South Africans who immediately followed, together it's almost a perfect primer of the legal and moral cause of Palestine. I think it should be required viewing for anyone who cares about justice. I'll just finish with this. I'm sorry on this thing. That's the essential legal point. The Palestinians are human beings with human rights. And that as human beings, they don't have to negotiate for their rights. They don't have to beg the US or the UK or the Israelis or the Norwegians or the Security Council for those rights. As a matter of international law, those rights are not conditional. They're human rights. They're inalienable. They're not aspirational at the end of some Oslo process. They're the bottom line. And that's what this case is really about. It's about saying, sorry, you had 3 decades to play your political games. This is a question of law. And as a matter of law, the Palestinian people have human rights. That's, I think, what the case is really about in the first instance.
Incredible. Craig Mokhiber, thank you so much for spending time with us today. We always really appreciate your incredible analysis and insight. And what should, just a final question, what is the most important thing that people watching this live stream or listening can do? The ICJ is happening, the Security Council happened, but what can regular folks do right now? What is the most important thing you think?
I think this is the time to make a righteous noise for everybody, wherever you are. If you're in a university and they're trying to silence you, get louder. I realize there's a lot of personal risk that comes with that, but they cannot silence us unless we agree to be silenced. If you're not involved in the anti-apartheid movement, get involved. If you're not participating in BDS, participate. find out about these things, bring pressure to bear. If you're living in a Western country that is complicit in the horrors that are happening in Palestine, we have a special obligation to bring pressure to bear, to educate our compatriots who are suffering under this brownout of information from corporate media companies that are themselves complicit in genocide and apartheid. And you know, there is a rumble that is growing, you know, these days, that's coming from below. It's coming from ordinary people. It's coming from just, you know, Jews and Christians and Muslims and agnostics and labor unions and social movements and students. And it's coming from the ground that has now become impossible to ignore. And that has to become loud enough to actually get just more than rhetoric from the Joe Bidens of the world and others. We have to demand accountability for the perpetrators, including those who are complicit. We have to demand redress for the victims and the survivors. And that's only going to come from us. So just get involved, educate people, speak out, and you know, don't be complicit through silence and inaction either. This is one of those moments. This is our Holocaust moment, and it's our duty, all of us, to make a righteous noise.
Indeed. Craig Mokhiber, thank you so much. We'll have you back on very soon. Thanks for all you do.
Thank you so much, Craig. Thank you.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.